My name is Earl Evans, and I'm a retro computing enthusiast and podcaster. And I have the pleasure today of speaking with Bill Hurd and Margaret Morabito. They've written a book, Back into the Storm, a design engineer's story of Commodore computers in the 1980s. Hi, Bill. Hi, Margaret.
Hi,
Hey,
Earl.
Evan. Hey, VCF. How you doing? Hi, Margaret.
Hey, Bill. Hi, everybody.
So by way of introduction, and I am, by the way, if you see me looking off to the side, I'm going to refer to my notes because like we were saying just a minute ago, the old noggin's not what it used to be. I don't want to leave out any details. But Margaret Morabito is a former technical editor and writer for Run magazine, a contributing editor and writer for Amiga World magazine, also the founder and director of Cal Campus, which is an accredited online post-secondary school which she first developed and operated on QLake for Commodore users. Later on Delphi, CompuServe, PC Link, Genie, and AOL. You got all the greatest hits of the online services, didn't you?
Yeah, hit them all.
The school can be found today at calcampus.edu. And Margaret's also author of the Vintage Commodore 128 Personal Computer Handbook, which was published in 2019, although it was actually started a long time ago, and we will chat about that as we get into the conversation. And Bill Hurd actually wrote the foreword for that book. Now, Bill Hurd joined Commodore at the age of 24. He didn't have a degree, but he was an experienced system designer thanks to working at Pennsylvania Scale Company. And Bill, help me out with the pronunciation here. Is this Leola, PA?
Leola, Pennsylvania, in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. So it was right in the heart of Amish country.
Perfect. Bill was the lead hardware engineer on the Plus4 series of computers, which included a lot of greatest hits here: the C116, the C232, the C264, the C364V, the Commodore 16, and the Plus4. He's also the initial designer and architect for the Commodore LCD computer, which sadly was never built. And I imagine we'll chat about that for a minute later. And Bill was the lead hardware engineer and the initial architect designer of the Commodore 128 hardware. After Commodore, Bill co-authored a patent in machine vision and was an early designer of the backup alarm found on modern cars. And he's produced videos for Hackaday, which I've seen and very much enjoyed. So again, glad to be talking with both of you. Let's chat about the book. Where did the idea for the book come from, and why now?
It's at the heart of it. I'm getting old, and I had a wonderful memory for most of my life, and suddenly I found my memory starting to fade. And I had this fear that I wanted to get these stories down. And then a friend of mine passed away, and that's actually part of the book, and it's the real impetus behind it, where it's like, oh my gosh, our time has come, and I wanted his name to be out there amongst the stories themselves. So it was really, time had passed, and we're feeling very mortal. So that was kind of the impetus behind it.
So who started the book, and who of the two of you approached who?
Well, I had, as you mentioned, done the foreword for Margaret. So that was kind of the providence of everything. If that hadn't happened, if she hadn't come to me and asked, I forget how that all transpired, but if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have had somebody to go to say, hey, I've got an idea for a book. So it started really with Margaret's C128 book, which came out, 30, 40 years after the C128. And, so what I did was, I always knew how I'd start a book if I were to start one. And it's the story about these guys were playing poker while I'm madly typing away on my calculator. They're not watching the numbers, they're watching me. And I suddenly figured out that this was a game about interaction with people, and then there was a problem they weren't telling me about. And so I sent that. Margaret, was that the first story I sent you? That one? And I think I sent you the beginning and the ending as kind of how the book would be. And it was only up to us to fill out that whole arc then that goes into the middle.
How
Yeah,
did you,
that was the easy part, wasn't it, Bill?
The middle or the beginning and the ending.
Beginning and the ending.
Yes, yes.
But yeah, Bill, to follow up on what you said, when I was updating my book from that I had written 35 years ago, it was in 2018 that I contacted you.
Okay.
And I was asking
4 years
you,
ago.
it's amazing. It's gone, I mean, it's gone by so quickly, but I was asking you some technical questions about the C-128. And as time passed, you know, you answered me. I was so happy to hear back from you so I could clarify that and just to hear from you because we didn't know each other.
Right.
And yet I was writing the book about your computer. So it was really nice. And then finally later on, when I was getting close to publication of mine, I asked you if you would write the forward and
Right. Okay.
it really worked out well.
Right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
so that's how the book got started, and that's how you bumped into each other, was actually, it sounds like, Margaret, your book, we've mentioned it now on the Commodore 128. It was published in 2019, and I've started reading that book as well and really enjoying it, by the way.
Good.
But the genesis of that book goes back quite a ways, doesn't it?
Yeah, it goes all the way back to the beginning. It was in early 1985. I was technical editor for Run. We knew that the computer was coming out because it had been announced at the CES. And we've got stories about that in the book, in Bill's book. And so I got an early version of the C-128 from Commodore. It's actually a Rev 6, which I found out later in working with Bill on his book,
Right.
was one of the early revisions that was actually shown at that 1985 CES show. So, I have a limited edition C-128.
Yes, you do.
But
Nice.
that, once I got a hold of that, which was, I think it was around February, something like that, I started working on my book. And I was really aiming to have it released in the fall of that year, which would coincide roughly with when the public would be able to get the computer. And in my book, I tell a story. You've probably read part of that because that was early on. Anyway, as it turned out, the company that I had the contract with decided against it. So rather than pursuing another publisher, I mean, things were just really moving ahead quickly, getting into other technologies. So I just put the book on a shelf and, you got to read the book to see the rest of the story.
Yeah, we don't want to give it all away here. But one thing I do want to mention about it, though, when you read a book on a particular topic, you can tell kind of whether the author has an investment in that topic, if they like what they're writing about. And it was pretty clear you were very enthusiastic back then about the Commodore 128 and what the possibilities were for that
Definitely.
machine.
Yeah,
And it-
definitely.
And it sounds
Yeah.
like you still are
I
enthusiastic.
am.
She still has a working C-128.
I've
Yeah.
got-
Mhm.
Bill, I've got 3 of them and they
Right,
all
right.
still work. Yeah, I think it's a great computer.
Wow.
Yeah,
I'm still part of the club too.
yeah.
It's amazing
love
that
this
they
guy.
work. They were designed to last 3 to 5 years.
Mhm.
And yeah, they're still working 35 years later. And we're talking about them 35 years later, even in a small group, which at the time, none of us conceived would ever happen. We were living in Commodore at time, like dog years. We're already thinking about what the next computer looks like in 16-bit architectures. We didn't think we'd be talking about this after a year or two.
That was the thing also with the 128, there was like a small window where
Right,
it had the
right.
spotlight on it. And once that spotlight moved, it went to the Amiga and that was the whole,
Right.
That's what everyone was talking about. And that was in 1985 also. So there, back then things were moving ahead so quickly. I remember we basically at the magazine, we were scrambling to keep up with the technological advances that were coming out of Commodore. Just when we were learning about the +4, it seemed, okay, now we're getting the announcement about the C-128. and the LCD also, but the C128 seemed to be the one that actually came into focus, not the LCD. And then, boom, I'm going down to Westchester to look at the Amiga. So it was like so many different things were happening, and really there was a lot to keep up with, a lot to study, a lot to learn and to absorb.
And the C128 was absolutely supposed to fill that little narrow gap. We weren't quite ready with the Amiga to come out. And it was like, you know, it's kind of like throwing yourself on the barbed wire fence so that the bigger project can continue. We knew we needed something to show at CES. Underneath, we needed to keep our revenue going. You know, the C64 was starting to kind of hit the tail of its lifetime. And so there was that rare opportunity where, and Jack Trammell had left, where the engineers decided, hey, there's that gap. We need something for CES. Just try and stop us because we're going to make this computer. So it absolutely was supposed to be the run up to the Amiga. And to that end, even get people used to 80 column monitors and those kind of things. We were kind of the trial balloon for some of those products.
And yet, even though you might have thought of it as an interim product, it still wound up selling several million units, as I recall.
Millions. It's fair to say it made over $1 billion of 1980s money, up to maybe $1.5 billion. So it actually provided revenue that we never dreamed of, you know, at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's the number I use is it sold 6.8 million. I think there's numbers as low as 4.5 million, something like that. So there's a range in there of what those are. So, but if that's the one thing, if I get to pick how I believe history, I remember the 6.8 million number. So I'm only human.
So regarding the book, we talked about some, you know, we'll chat about some specific stories that are in there because it's just chock full of fun stories about your years there. But in general, what's covered in the book? How would you summarize it?
If I'd start by apologizing that it is a bunch of little stories, and I don't know how readable that is. Margaret and I have gotten used to reading it in that fashion. But the choice was, do I chalk in every little funny story I can remember or just the ones in a small story arc? And we opted for, no, let's put all the stories in and let you guys weed through them and figure out what's funny and what isn't. But the main idea was it was supposed to be a fun read. You know, it was supposed to be something that you might not have liked that story, but you can relate to the story after that. So that was kind of the genesis of it was, and that's the way my memory is. I probably don't have the real memory of these stories anymore, but I had the memories of these stories. I've told them so often. So, and I think Margaret will attest that anytime we start a story, out comes the same story again. The stories didn't change over time. Correct me if I'm wrong, Margaret, but 2 years after we were at the end of it here, the stories are the same old stories, unfortunately, but also fortunately.
But you know what, I think what we were able to do is to follow the line from the design standpoint, from your job standpoint. Right. We tried to take that and go almost chronologically and to show the bumps and the hurdles that Bill and his team had to go through. And then the challenge was to fit in the humorous stories, you know, like the packing peanuts and the rubber bands and, you know, etc. So every so often, what I decided to do, and we agreed on this, was we would insert a section in a chapter, such as games and humor, and we would put several of those humorous stories in that section, which related to what was happening at that time point when they were working on the TED or they were working on the C128. So as you're going through, we tried to announce in advance through the headings, through the subtitles, if we're going to be kind of drifting into humor and game mode. So, you know, you could be prepared for that change.
Right.
Well, I know that every reader will look at a particular written work with, you know, coming from their own perspective. From my perspective, I did find it to be a fun read. I thought, you know, it was a good mix of chronological and stream of consciousness. At some points, I felt like we were sitting down and having a conversation, and you were telling me some stories from the good old days,
Right.
but in an approachable fashion that you could kind of track with what was going on through, again, the chronological aspect of it. You know, here we're at the initial interview, and here we're at the TED, and here we're at the lull after CES. I thought it flowed very nice.
Well, and you were from that era yourself. You worked at Seiko Epson at the time, if I remember correctly.
That's right.
And so you had the same number of bits I have in our chronology of things. Yes.
We both had 8 bits.
Yes,
That's true.
Occasionally I had 7, and I'd have to fix it and it'd be 8 again, you know, but that was the act of fixing things.
So in terms of the workflow of producing the book, you mentioned that you would meet, what was it, on a weekly basis? And would you kind of walk through material that was added, or did you just kind of do a dump of material and then figure out how to organize it? How'd that come together?
Yeah, Margaret, you want to speak to the Google Docs and how you, because Margaret did most of the management of the material. I simply provided the content. And then, you know, as I say, that, you know, Margaret took the ravings of a madman and took them in and turned them into the scribblings of a madman. So I absolutely couldn't have done it without her actually bringing English to the table. But in addition to that, this is what Margaret does. And so she knew, she had these processes for putting a book together.
So what happened, and it was in the fall of 2019 that Bill contacted me and said, how about writing a book together? And so I thought about it. I went back in my emails to see how long it took me to say yes, and it was 2 days. So it was something I wanted to do. So it was in mid-December, Bill set up a Google site, Google Drive, and he started uploading all the stuff that he had, photos, images, stories that had been written already, articles that were out there, videos, you know, the stuff that he had accumulated over the years. And he had a rough outline for the TED, you know, early, middle, and late TEDs. So he tried early on to kind of categorize that.
Right.
And from my viewpoint, I had to learn a lot about Bill. I know that,
I'm sorry.
Bill has fans, but I just, you know, I wasn't kind of in that circle where I had been watching a lot of his videos and this and that. So over Christmas vacation, I started watching his videos so that I could become familiar with the stories. And so as time went by and we headed into 2020, it was late spring, early summer when we really dove in and we started to meet on a Zoom meeting every week. What we would do is we would open up the Google Drive, and then we would open up the Zoom meeting so that we had them side by side and we could both be seeing what we were talking about. At the beginning, we really had to figure out what was going to be our kind of like our MO for doing this. And we started off early with recording our discussion. And that proved to be kind of burdensome because the translator program, you know, it was
Didn't translate. Yes.
Yeah, it wasn't that great. It took a lot of time later on to kind of like translate what the translator had translated. So as it evolved, I ended up following Bill's original classification of the early, middle, and late framework for the TED, and I moved that over to the C128, and then we kind of blended in the middle where the LCD came in, because we knew that people would want to hear about the LCD also. But as it turned out, what would happen would be Bill would provide writings for me and he would dump them into the drive. I would take them and I would put them in the areas where I thought they should be. As we got more and more focused, we came up with, you know, chapters, chapter titles, and then we got to the point where we said, okay, we've got enough material now, let's just work on chapter 1. Let's get a chapter done. And so we would go through and we would do a whole section just devoted to chapter 1. and go through all the stories that we wanted to put in, arrange it and this and that, so that we got it pretty much set. Then we go on to the next one, and we just went through like that. When we got all 7 of them done, then it was, okay, let's put them all together in one big file. And that way we were able to search through much more easily to see, did we duplicate something? Did we already talk about that? Did we make a mistake someplace? All kinds of questions, but we were able to then, and that was probably what, 9 months later?
Yeah.
That we finally got to the point where we could put it in one big file.
Right.
So we could work on it from there. So there was a lot of back and forth, because what would happen, Bill would put in stories, I would place them and do what I do with them. Being very aware all the time, both of us, that we wanted to keep Bill's voice. We didn't want my voice to interfere with whatever editing or rearranging and inserting transitions and this and that. We wanted to keep Bill's voice, and I think we did a pretty good job at that. Anyway, that's how we went about it. And so on Thursdays, we'd meet for about an hour and a half, and we'd chat about what we had done. Bill would say things like, well, I want to change that wording. No, this section should go up there. So he would be able to see what had happened in the previous week where I was working on his material, and then try to, focus it in, make sure it was absolutely correct. And then there was also the aspect of technical questions, because Bill knows what he's talking about. And I didn't necessarily.
Arguably.
I didn't necessarily understand the electronics part, and all that. So I tried to approach it from the viewpoint of a reader who would be reading this, who wasn't necessarily an expert in computer electronics. So
and that was something I wanted, the tech details in there. If you read the book, you might go, why are you talking about the slew rate? The production had taken it upon themselves to put capacitors on the board of the Commodore 64 to make them appear to pass the test. Whether it was good for the machine or not was completely a second issue. And so I talk about what those capacitors did, and they didn't slow it down. They changed the slew. Well, I just wanted the technical details in there, hopefully in a way that if you didn't want to read the technical detail, you could kind of glump over it. But if you were interested, you'd go, I learned something, or that's something I knew, but it's cool to see it in writing. So yeah, this thing's chock full of the tech details, things like how we added a shift lock key and a caps lock key, and when you press another key, suddenly it looks like 4 keys are pressed. It's called a phantom key. So I took the time to explain phantom key, which you could just probably remove from the book, but at the same time, it's like, no, that was one of our challenges. Commodore had never had a caps lock key before like that. So it's like we were the first, or a reset circuit or something like that.
I thought that it was
interesting.
Yeah, it was great that those tech details were in there. You were talking about clock sync and back bias and slew rates. And,
yes, I was.
A variety of things in there that showed some of the technical challenges, but also what was it that you'd said in the book that at the time you were trying to not have a day go by without solving the challenges
you had to
of
fix
the
every
day.
major problem overnight. Yeah. You'd have some carryover little problems. And I talk about how I'd start each day with a list of problems. And by the end of the day, they'd be all scratched out and maybe some new ones added to the list. But no single huge problem survived the night. And there were nights where they got fixed at 5 in the morning. I mean, we were getting close to 8 o'clock, the witching hour, when management would show back up and want status reports. So we had to get done. That we worked two and 3 shifts, because the management was around during the first shift. There was a limit to the amount of things you could get done. So, I chose that as my time to interact with management. Come 6 o'clock in the evening, we started fixing stuff in earnest. And come 2 in the morning after last call, that's when the really bad problems would get fixed, because they must be bad ones if they made it all the way to 2 in the morning. So things like Z80s got added at 2 in the morning. The PLL tower, the very first one that was made, first worked at 5 in the morning. And I talk in the book about how I'd have a technician dedicated to me. We'd hot bunk. I had an air mattress in my office, and my record was 11 days without leaving the office. And the technician would be asleep in the air mattress, and I come wake them up at 2 in the morning. I'm like, here, wire this up and stuff. And they go wire it. I catch a nap. And then they'd wake me up at 4 in the morning, and we'd look at whatever it was. So it was the best time of my life.
So you
fun.
don't do something like that unless it's a labor of love, I think.
Yeah.
And just like the book,
True passion.
what you just described about the amount of work. I mean, it might look easy to an external observer, but I've talked to enough folks now that have written the book that it's not easy. It's a labor of love to put it together. It takes a lot of time and effort and
Right.
thoughtfulness.
Right.
You know,
Yeah,
it's
Go ahead.
I just want to say, Bill, you were telling me when we worked on the book how you would walk around with the schematics of the TED. You know, it's like wherever
Rolled
you
up.
would get the schematics. Well, you know what I was doing during this period, I would have printouts of the book, and here I am walking around with your book, going into the living room, looking it over at night. You know, it's like it reminded me of you walking around with your schematics. I'm walking around with your
Schematics,
book.
Right.
Go on.
And those schematics, we used to take them to the bar. That was back before cell phones. So if we wanted during the day when management was around, we'd actually go to the bar, and some of the schematics had beer stein rings on the corners, because we would use the beer glasses to stake out the corners of the schematic so it wouldn't curl up while we were working. So
I hope you kept one of those. That'd
I-
be hilarious to see.
I did find one. There's a picture of it in the book. I found my original TED schematic where I added the reset circuit, and maybe I'll bring that to VCF East this year. I'm speaking there in, I guess, October. And forgive me if I had the month wrong, but I'm hoping to bring some of the artifacts that I talk about in here at some of the prototype books and stuff. So
Yeah, it's on
Now-
page 39. There you go.
yeah, it's hard to see. Yeah, that's the one thing. We wish we could have had color pictures in the printed book, but we were self-publishing through Amazon, and that really wasn't an option for us. So we, unfortunately, if you want to see the color pictures, you gotta get the Kindle version. It's possible we may get all the color pictures up online on c128.com or something like that at some point. So now one thing I did want to throw out about the production process, because I had to learn. I started by typing, but many of you know I injured my hand a few years back, and I actually lost a finger on my hand, which really sucks when it comes to typing. I still have the memory, I almost said memory management unit. I have the muscle memory of typing is still fighting my hand when I try and type. And so ultimately I started transcribing using Google Docs, using the built-in transcriber. So Margaret had to learn to debug Bill Hurd's writings twice, once from when I was typing, but then she had to learn the kind of errors that crept in with transcribing. But at the end of the book, I was having to do a lot of, I couldn't keep typing, my hand would swell and stuff. And so we ended up transcribing a lot of it.
And you mentioned that it went through Amazon, right? That's where you can get the book.
Yes. Yeah. It's if you Google Margaret's name, my name, or Back into the Storm, or Commodore, actually, I noticed it showed up under there, or C128. But as you said, the name of it's Back into the Storm.
Yeah, it's the KDP publication,
Which means what?
Kindle something.
Yes. Yes. The K means Kindle. Didn't mean to put you on the spot there. I didn't know what it meant either.
I think it's Kindle digital publication. I don't know,
So
something like that.
Well, you brought up the
Okay.
photos. That was one of the first things I was going to talk about before we jumped into the narrative of the book. There are tons of photos in there, and they
Yeah.
really help augment the stories that are told as you go along. Talk a little bit, if you could, about the process of putting those photos together, gathering them up. Yeah, I love that you gave attribution for
yes,
those.
yeah.
For every single one you mentioned. where it came
Everybody that's
from.
in the book, with like one or two exceptions, I was able to get a hold of. We were able to get a hold of and get
Yeah,
permission to be
beautiful.
in the book. And same with all the photos. But what blows me away about the photos is you can look at them and go, That's from the 1980s. That's how people dressed in the 1980s. That's
Oh,
how, I mean,
yes.
it's got everything except a picture of my dots and Z in there, right? And a Michelob bottle like they had back in the day. So yeah, it is. And there are some new ones. We got help from many wonderful people supplied us with new pictures, especially the TED series and stuff. Rob Clark was real instrumental in getting us a lot of the old ones, who's a friend of mine. So we reached out to the community when we needed help with modern pictures, because I simply don't have all these variations laying around to take pictures of. So, and then even my 128's kind of off colored and stuff, you know, it's 35 years old.
Every 128 is a different color, I think.
Every 128's a different color. Yes, it is.
Hey,
So
Bill, I think one of my favorite pictures in the book is of you skydiving at CES. That cracks me
that's
up.
yeah, I love the story. It goes with that, where we, so Greg Berlin and I went suite shopping, which is where you just walk around the open suites in the hotels. And if you've got a thing that says you work for Commodore, all the doors were open. And we stopped in Electronic Arts. They're like, oh my God, somebody from Commodore. And we're kind of like, oh my God, somebody from Electronic Arts. And as we're leaving, they're like, well, can we get you anything else? And I poured it to it. They had a case of Michelob bottles. I'm like, I could use that case. They picked it right up and set it on my shoulder. So I go walking out. Here we are walking the streets of Las Vegas with a case of beer on our shoulders. And Greg Berlin and I see this thing, which is where they had an old DC-10 engine in this building that blows up, and you jump into the slipstream and you do skydiving indoors. And we're like, let's go do that. So we walk in with this case of beer. They actually made room in the refrigerator, and we could put all the beer in the refrigerator and kept it cool while we're doing the skydiving thing. And then we reloaded the case when it was time to go back out and do Vegas. So there's a whole story behind the picture. The one picture that I would have liked to have gotten in there that wouldn't have fit, because we didn't talk about the wrap party of the C-128. It's just not in the book. It doesn't belong. It's a G-rated book, so it doesn't belong in there. But I still have they gave away $25 coins for the MGM hotel for the chips, and I still have mine. And that would have been a great memento shot, but it would have been Bill's chip from the C-128 wrap party that we're not talking about.
that we don't speak of.
Yeah. So we don't. Yeah. You catch me afterwards. We'll talk about it anytime. We're just not talking about it in a book, which I can't later retract, you know.
Understood. So the book's titled Back into the Storm, but the first time that you went into the storm, when you started at Commodore, it sounded like the interview process had its ups and downs.
Yes. Oh, I blew the interview. Yeah, like 3 times. I forget it's how many times I blew it. I blew it when I walked in to talk to Bob Russell and Frank Hughes, and by almost sheer luck, they invited me to the plant. And the way he invited me, I didn't know I was going for a second round of interview. So I show up in a t-shirt and jeans a second time, I might add. And, you know, the whole story's in the book. By immediately planting myself in my boss-to-be's office, I walked in, there's this beautiful office looking out over a window and a chair on this side of the thing. I plop myself down in it. And the next thing I hear is, "You are sitting in my chair." So now I'm sitting in the guy's chair who's supposed to interview me. And he goes, "Where's your resume?" I'm like, "I didn't know I was being interviewed." And I didn't have, so one of the guys from the night before said, "I have his resume." And that saved my job a second time. And so there's more to it than that. But yeah, it was sheer luck that I got hired by Commodore. I mean, I didn't go to college for any of this stuff, but I had studied the 6502. I knew it was cold. And suddenly I found myself in the building where they made 6502s. I mean, wearing my MOS shirt today, because at the time I was actually hired by MOS Technologies on behalf of Commodore. So my original paycheck said MOS. And we worked above what I called the Dragon. That was the chip foundry below. And I call it the Dragon because you fed it dirty sand and it farted out these wafers of finished chips. And they were magical. I mean, nobody except Commodore made their own chips back. TI maybe, you know. but not like our VIC chip that was powered the Commodore 64. So it was truly a magical place to work. It was like working with wizards right next door to you. So it was just wonderful.
Well, the love of technology really came through in the book. And I love one of the stories that you told about photons, flipping bits
yes.
with photons.
Yes. And it's one of my more well-known stories, but you know, it was literally my first week there. And so I had been hired. I didn't know it till I read Brian Bagnall's book. I'd been hired as a technician. And in short, they didn't know what to do with me. They just were taking a chance on hiring me. And by the way, I'm talking about me, but in the book is about the team, right? So I'm going to tell a story about it's the observations of a young man of this wonderful team that did everything together. And that's what I liked about the C-128 Ford that I did for Margaret, is that it was the first exposure. It got everybody's names out there that said, no, this is all the people behind the C-128. So, but when I got so they thought I'd be a technician. Then they said, here, sit down. You're now writing code for disk drives, like the 4040 disk drive. I was supposed to write a patch for it or something. And I started wandering around, right? So I'm trying to dedicate myself to my job and wandering around like a kid in a candy store. And I go into this room and there's three guys looking through a microscope, taking turns looking through the microscope at a chip wafer that they're probing. They actually have little whiskers going down to this little tiny chip. And the guy goes, turn on the light. Okay, are we in NTSC mode? All right, turn off the light. And I'm like, what? Did you just use light to change the effect of one of the registers, the state the register's in? And they're like, to them, it's old hat. It's like, yeah, I'm like, I am working in the right place. This is what I want to do with my life. And, you know, I went into Commodore with the interview, not knowing I'd want to work there. I was just starting to look for a job. And unfortunately, halfway through the interview, I started going, I really want to work here. This is a wonderful place. So, yeah. So you got to read the whole story, though, about the lights, why they had to use a light to affect the register. Was there was a bug in the chip. Well, why was there a bug in the chip? The tools didn't exist that allowed them to take the schematic and compare to how the chip was made, called the DRC, or ERC, electrical rule check. It didn't exist in that time in the 1980s. It did 2 years later, but not then. And so it's a great story because it's them being so imaginative on how to troubleshoot in spite of these lack of tools we had. So yeah, it's my favorite story, probably.
Some of the techniques used back then to develop this stuff before it could kind of self-develop, before you had computers to make computers.
Right.
I remember stories about that Chuck Petal told about crawling around on the table on the vellums with the 6502. Yes. And
right. And I've heard that story where you kick off your shoes. And I mentioned that about crawling on light tables. They used to cut ruby lith. They literally hand laid out the chips. And I said that to an old chip guy. I said, did you guys really kick off your shoes and get up on the light tables? They go, not light tables, you'd fall through the table. You know, it's a glass top table with fluorescent lights under it. But there was still a card punch reader sitting in the corner when I got there. I've seen the original 6502 schematic, which was a religious experience for me. I just happened to mention it, and Mike, Angelina said, yeah, we got that around here. I'm like, you got what? The schematic? I'm like, it's like, yeah, we have the schematic. And so he goes, he opens the lowermost drawer of the oldest cabinet in the room. And I swear the lights dimmed and there's chanting and somebody started some incense burning. And it was a full religious experience. They had actually written it on parchment. You know, it looked like the Declaration of Independence, you know, and yeah. And so when we worked there, we didn't take the time to say, tell us about the great people who were here before us. We were so busy, but now that's the one regret I had was, I wish I had said, you know, I'm sitting in Chuck Petal's chair. Tell me more about Chuck, right? Because, you know, we joked that his cigar was still burning in the ashtray. They had just left when we got there. So there's just tons of stories I wish I had learned about, you know, prior to that had happened before I worked there.
Well, you put a lot of your stories down on paper, which I think is great. You've contributed to the public consciousness now of what life was like there during your time. So with the TED, you weren't there that long before they handed you that project, right?
So yeah, TED stands for text display, which was the chip itself of, in its smallest rendition, almost a single chip computer of the day. Nobody else had a chip that did everything that our TED chip did. It did the sound and graphics and managed the memory and everything. And so the TED was to be the Sinclair killer, right? And so I had wandered around that same week, basically, and I ran into the hardware guy, and I'm like, wait a minute, are you doing bus sharing with the processor? He goes, yeah, we are. I said, I'm doing that at home. I have a system. It's actually over there on the shelf to this day. And I'm like, I'm doing that at home. That's, yeah, how'd you get around this one problem? Did you have to delay this? And before the end of the week, Shraj Shivji, my old boss, called me in and said, basically, you're now the head of the TED project. And he pulled out the Timex Spectrum, the color version of the Sinclair, and said, this is what we're going up against. And so, yeah, by the end of the first week, I found myself in charge of hardware. So I had started as a technician, was supposed to then write code for the floppy drive, and ended up in charge of the hardware of the TED. Now, I didn't design the TED. It was done. So I always say I was the lead engineer for 3/4 of the TED project, but the design was done when I got there. So whereas the C128, I actually laid that down as a design on paper. The TED was designed by, and it was literally designed by the chip guys, because they did that wonderful chip at the center of TEDness. So, yep. Yeah, they snagged me early on for that one.
So real quick question, we're at a quarter till. I wanted to do a time check. I think we were saying at the beginning that we had a little bit of latitude.
We do have a little bit of latitude. We can run till the top of the hour and then do like 10 minutes or 15 minutes of questions, or you can start questions and answers whenever you want. It's really up to you. We kind of gave you guys a little bit more flexibility than usual, because we knew that there'd be questions.
You also knew I was involved, and I have yet to finish one of these talks on time.
I didn't want to mention that.
Yes. I thank you for that.
So you mentioned the teams that you worked with,
right?
And clearly you valued not just their technical expertise, but it seems
their wisdom.
Like, yeah,
yes.
their wisdom. It felt like family,
yes.
The way that you described it in the book.
And we did. We partied together. We cried together. We laughed together. One of the lines in the book is we'd get together and practice laughing, just so we knew how to laugh when we really needed to. But one of the things I try and clarify in the book is that Fred Bowen, I call him the father of the C128, because he was literally on it before I was. And the story's in the book, how he was working with an engineer, and it was going to be the D128. And some things happened and I got assigned to it. And Fred and I came up with that idea, and Terry Ryan, well, let's call it the C128 and see if anybody stops us. So I give the credit to Fred for being, and he was kind of the wise sage of our group. I give him the credit of being the father of the C128, which makes me the mother, right? And as I used to say, anybody was welcome to call me a mother if they wanted to. They just had to step up real nice and close to do it, so we could have a conversation. So, and then there was Greg Berlin and Dave Saracusa, who did the disk drive first for the TED. We had I forget the number, MPS 801, or maybe that's a printer, but whatever the disk drive was called.
1551.
1551, thank you. Yeah, I wasn't even close, was I? They did that for the TED series, and then they did the 1571 for the C128 series. Well, that meant they had to design a computer-based piece of instrumentation. It just happened to read disk drives instead of have a screen and a keyboard. They had to get it done at the exact same time also. And by the way, we're buying for some of the same resources. So when we talk about something like the TED computer getting done and the C128 getting done, they'd have been useless without the disk drives getting done right at the exact same time. So that was a real important part, that it wasn't just a team, it was a couple of teams, even though we were part of one big family, all working together. And in the book, I talk about how Thanksgiving became eating turkey. I'd set it on a 1571 drive out of aluminum foil, and the drive would keep my dinner warm for me. And for Christmas Eve, we'd stop by Greg Berlin's house on the hour and a half drive home. We'd stop by at his house, and he just happened to have presents for us because he knew we'd be stopping by on the way home. He had lived in the area. So yeah, it was the best time of my life with the best people I've ever met, is the simplest way to put it.
And it sounds like folks kind of knew how to take care of each other. I love the stories about the technicians kidnapping you when they could tell you needed a break. And
sadly, they could tell I needed a break. Yeah, I was being a bit of a dick. Not to hope that language is okay. I was being an a-hole. And they grabbed me and took me out and forced a couple beers upon me. And for a good 2 hours, I had no worries. I just rode around in the back of a car and just took my brain off the hook. And, at the end of that, I apologized to him because I had suddenly gotten self-awareness back. I'm like, guys, I'm sorry that you had to do this, basically. So, yeah. And one of my favorite stories is, a guy who threw an oyster cracker at Greg Berlin is 6'8". I was the only guy that messed with him, right? And he separated my shoulder. You can see it sticking out of my shirt there still to this day. And this technician winds up with an oyster cracker, one of those big ones, and just hurls it from 4 feet away at a full wind-up pitch. And it pops off Greg's head like that, rocks his head back. And he comes back forward and he makes this noise like, and he starts going for this guy who's now panicky. He starts throwing oyster crackers faster, trying to defend himself. But when we left the bar, Greg had picked him up by the belt and the back of the scruff of his neck, basically, and was shoving him into one of the bench seats in the restaurant. And we're just like, well, we're going back to work. You two work it out. And it was just that was just a typical Friday. That wasn't unusual. I wish I could remember all the bar stories, but they probably don't fit in this book.
Well, getting physical sounds like it was part of the experience.
It's part of yeah.
Yeah, I read about
young testosterone. Oh yeah, it was yeah. As
being tackled at the MGM.
And it was my fault. I left the opening for him to do that. I knew how to use somebody that tall, how to use his height against him, but I didn't figure on his arms being so long. He basically grabbed me and pulled me under him as we fell to the parking lot of the bar, and my shoulder came apart. And I was at work the next day. I mean, we couldn't stop working just because we're injured,
And a couple other stories where folks were trying to take care of each other. Nancy Ron, am I pronouncing that right?
Yes, you are.
You walked into her office and you were kind of...
I threw a hissy fit, yeah.
Yeah, because your card had stopped working, and she knew how to handle
how
the
to defuse
situation.
me, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So the middle management at Commodore included our security department's middle management. And so we had a lot of run-ins with security. And part of it was a certain amount, I don't want to call it incompetence, but one of the ways you knew you were laid off was your card would stop working before they told you were laid off. And the running joke was, if you're standing at the door with 3 other people and they're all idiots and none of your cards work, guess what? You've been laid off. Well, one day my card stopped working. I couldn't get into R&D. And somebody let me in, and I was busy. I was beside myself. I threw my card down like a little kid. I was just like, ah. And she just said, out. And I said, fine, I'll just leave then. I went home. I caught a shower. I caught a nap. I slept all night, slept till the very next day, as the Arlo says. And I walked in the next day and I'm like, oh, thank you for throwing me out. I needed that so bad. And she's like, oh, I didn't know how you were going to be when you came in. And so I was very thankful for that. So yeah, there was, and somebody would tell you when you needed to go take a shower. We were good to each other that way. It's like, you need to borrow my apartment to take a shower, Bill. It's like, oh yeah, now that you mention it, sure.
Or you might need a box of tissues, like Rimi-chan had given you that time.
Right. Yeah. So in Japan, so I had a habit of using toilet paper for almost everything. It's wonderful stuff. I always had a roll of toilet paper, cleaning whiteboards, anything like that. Well, in Japan, all your desks are pushed together, and I'd gone to the bathroom and got a roll of toilet paper and set it on my desk. And this crossed a cultural boundary, I'm thinking, because Rimi-chan took it away from me. She said, "No, B-chan, please do not use." And she went out and bought me a box of Kleenexes at lunch so that I had a civilized way to act. You know, I could get away with a lot because I was a gaijin, a foreigner, but I crossed a boundary when I got the roll of toilet paper and set it on my desk.
So it sounds like there were lots of clutch situations while you were there. I mean, things where it literally came down to the last minute. I was laughing my head off reading about how you were debugging that problem for the Kmart demo while, so you're trying to debug a problem while simultaneously you've got another employee that's having a complete freak out on you, thinking that you've done something with, was it his eyeglasses or?
Yeah, he had lost his glasses. He was the head of Commodore International Marketing. I mean, he was the big wig in international. We had America's Marketing and International. And this was when I was this is my first CS show. It was for the TED. It was, and we had a talking version of TED. We had the guys from the TI Speak and Spell had produced, we had scarfed them up from TI, had made a talking chipset that went in there. And we were supposed to meet them there and do a talking magic desk. And what the magic desk was, if you think that Max invented the desktop, you'd be wrong. We had something called the magic desk back in '84. And it was supposed to talk. Well, when we put the chip in, and the chip had never been in the computer before, when we put the chip in, it went and then it'd crash, right? And you turn off and on, it'd make the exact same noise, and then it'd crash. And I'm sitting there going, I'm looking at this thing, and I start remembering, I'm like, I had told the guy laying out the PC board he could make a change to aid in the routing. And we had two boards, and I look at it, and I could remember the pinout of the chips. And I look at it and I go, the pinout's wrong on that chip. And so we take a soldering iron. I don't know why I had a soldering iron. I had a soldering iron and no solder. I took wires off the other board. So now the other board's trashed. It's no good. And I used a soldering iron to cut some traces, just pillage right through the traces and solder these wires on. I'm burning my fingers. And I'm doing this all from memory. I'm going, okay, we used the wrong output of this chip, so I'm going to use this other output. Meanwhile, this guy, and we're doing this in the suite, Commodore suite, on the fireplace stoop, whatever that part of the fireplace is called. And, you know, that was our own little corner there. Well, finally, he figures out that I must have taken his glasses because everybody else had said they had. So he's screaming at me like a drill sergeant. Where was my glasses? Kmart's coming here in a few minutes. And meanwhile, I'm trying to just get it working. And thank goodness I had been in the service, because I had actually had a drill sergeant scream at me from inches away. And I had learned to focus. And so I basically ignored him. Suddenly we plug this chip in and it goes, "Welcome to the magic desk. We can't believe that it's working." Somebody figures out that the guy's eyeglasses have been in his breast pocket all the time. So now everybody's happy. As we're leaving the suite, I get halfway down the hall and I pass three guys in blue suits. And I realized it was Kmart, and my legs wobbled. I got past them and my legs wobbled exactly once. I was like, that was Kmart. I got done in time for Kmart. And that was a significant event for the young Bill Hurd, because after that, I knew I could do the job. That was the moment when my Commodore-ness had matured. And I was like, from now on, I know I can get this job done no matter what it is. We will succeed. And I'd like to think that we did at everything we set out to be. So it's a funny story because of this guy yelling at me, but it's also creating these wires, taking them off this other board while stooping on a fireplace in the suite, to finishing literally, 3 minutes before Kmart walked in the door.
I noticed that in a lot of cases, the team had confidence. And
in
I
each
wish-
other. Yeah.
in each other, in the ability to get the job done. And I was wondering what you think on this. It felt to me, reading the book, that if the team hadn't had that self-assurance that you could actually walk through fire and make it out to the other side, that in some of the cases, maybe it just wouldn't have come together.
Yeah, if we couldn't fix every problem before the next day, what if the problems started piling up instead of staying the same size or getting smaller? You know, and there were times where the programmers would be so busy and I'd be so busy, we didn't necessarily get a chance to talk to each other that day. But it's like I knew that on noon of the right day, they'd be there with the chip and I'd be there with the board, and we'd put them together and it would work. So I had full confidence in them as well that they could hold up their part of it, which allowed me to do my part of it. So yeah, it's wonderful being a member of a team that of people you love. I mean, as you mentioned, the family. I still love those guys to this day, and if any of them called and needed anything, and I'm hesitant to say that out loud because Greg Berlin will want me to mow his lawn or something. But it's if any of them needed anything, I'd be in the car in a second.
Another thing you mentioned was life after CES, how it was like stomping on the brakes. And then toward the end of the book, life after Commodore. And so talk a little bit about that. Was that kind of, I imagine that was quite a ramp down of,
it was
physically
like,
and emotionally.
Yeah. I thought I could, and I left Commodore because I thought the writing was on the wall. I didn't know Commodore would continue for as long as it did. But with that said, I am so glad I'm not part of the era looking back, because I'd have been fired. The middle management problem got worse without Jack Trammell's leadership. So I'm from that small group of people that had worked for Jack Trammell and then knew what it was like to have Jack Trammell missing. And so when you hear me talking about the middle management problem, that's kind of like the wolves were now multiplying, or sheep, or somebody was multiplying, because there was nobody to call them, and there was no over guiding management to help us out. So when I left, I thought I could just go anywhere and keep making chips and doing this. And that was a real rude awakening for me. I just, it was, I called Commodore the little big company because it was $1 billion company. And yet it was 8 of us doing most of the work. And I thought that could translate to other places, and it just didn't. So I really was heartbroken after I left Commodore, to be honest.
Well, it's clear that you loved that time. And Margaret, I'll say that it was clear that you were having a good time in the 80s too with that technology. Yeah. And I remember those times very fondly myself. It's fun to look back on it. There's so many good stories that we left on the table. I've literally got 2 more printed pages here that I could talk about.
You'll have to read the book and to find out where the title of the book comes from. It's the one thing I'll throw out there before we end is the title of the book is very personal to me, and you have to read the last page of the book, quite honestly, to find out where the name comes from. But I'll say it's something that actually got said in full context, and it represented that a small tiny slice of my life when that name came out like that. So read the book would be my advice for catching all these stories.
Absolutely. Well, and I'll say that if folks read the book, I just want to throw one more thing out there. Don't skip the glossary. You may come to the end and you might think, well, I know what some of these terms mean, but you're going to miss something if you don't read through the glossary, because there are some gems in there among the definitions.
Right. And that's the beauty that Margaret brought to the table, was knowing how to do things like that.
That's good to hear that you read the glossary.
I read all the way through it. I laughed, I cried. I brought the whole family.
Very good.
Well, we're at the top of the hour, so I guess, can we take some questions?
It's funny, some of these stories Bill's telling could be told today with some companies as well. So interesting, the grass is, you can say, always greener, but it really is, similar.
Well, we're hoping they inspire somebody to want to make a movie of it. And the stories are out there as fodder to start a movie or a TV series. If they can make a TV series on Halt and Catch Fire, which is a 6502 command, by the way.
I just, as you were telling the story about the resoldering of, just because you had the pinouts wrong at the last minute, I'm just thinking of trade shows that I've been in where we've had such similar things. That was
It's
maybe
amazing.
years ago.
Bill, so my question is, have you been in contact with any other Commodore engineers that you're encouraging to write their own books?
Funny you should say that. I'm recommending that Fred Bowen be the next person to reach out to Margaret because Fred was there before I was there. He was there while I was there. He was there after I was there. And so I tried to plant the seed. We'll have to see if that happens. But I absolutely, Dave Haney would be another one, Jeff Porter, Berlin. These guys could all write their own versions of it if they had a mechanism that, like I did, to help get the words into English and written down in a way that's readable. So that's a great question.
Hello, Bill. Nice to see you. I wish I could see you here next time in person. I haven't read this book, but I was wondering if you can tell, or just tell in the book something about the story of Amiga. We designed it and they F up part. I don't know if you were aware. And I saw that you were doing a lot of Commodore design that was groundbreaking. We had to cut because of costs, right? So can you tell us about that?
So there was a lot of distortion there, but it sounded like you were asking about cost reduction or how we had to be mindful of cost.
I think he was asking about that you had some really cool technology and stuff that you had worked on, but you couldn't proceed with it because it just would cost too much.
Yeah, it cost too much and what we could get done in 5 months. And, it's hard for me to think of examples right at the moment because it was kind of a culture. If I could save 10 cents, I was ecstatic. If I could save $1, I got drunk. I just went out that night and had a good time. So, part of it was the cost savings, but part of it then was the producibility of it. And it just had to be every part of your culture. Because if you cost something, cost an extra penny, well, a penny times $1 million is a lot of pennies, let alone 5 or 6 million. So you can imagine saving 10 cents or whatnot. And we weren't concerned with these computers lasting 35 years or even 10 years. We just needed it to last 3 years. So we let things get right on the boundaries of what we didn't build in margins like we could have. And I had done instrumentation. I knew how to design something to handle high temperatures and steam washdown and stuff like that. But quite honestly, I was designing consumer products. And so we designed them, I don't want to say like toys, but they were kind of the toys of the computer industry.
You didn't design those cases not to turn yellow.
I don't even know if we would have had a way to predict that they would have done that 20 years later. I have yet to hear a mechanical engineer that I trust tell me why they turn yellow. I've heard some theories and I believed some of them for a while, but now I no longer believe why they turn yellow. I don't think it's the bromine in short.
The cases were just scared you'd throw them away. So is there any other?
Well, they didn't have 30 years of history on anything back then. They had a couple years of history.
Well,
Same
yeah.
with the chips. I'm real surprised that some of those chips still work today because they were inventing the recipe while they were making the chips for production. When you hear of people like Bill mention stuff, those guys didn't just design the 6502, they designed the processes that they used to design the 6502. So, I mean, they're doing metallurgy and stuff on the fly.
I don't know if this is a plug for something else you did, but I could swear you did something about the fact that you were amazed chips worked 30 years later. I think you did a talk or something on that. Or
I did a talk of VCF East and West. I did a talk about component aging because people thought that we had been truly negligent, not putting heat sinks on everything. And the reality is a component plugged into the PC board's the biggest heat sink of all. But even sitting at room temperature is still temperature. And so parts age just sitting. They don't have to be plugged in and running. And there are some things you can do. You don't want to stick them in the freezer either. So yeah, I did a whole talk on component aging. But underneath it all was my complete amazement that these things still work after so long ago. And that there's people like you guys that are interested in them 30 and 35 years ago. That to me is the most amazing thing.
It seems we don't have any more questions, which is a rarity, because I know when you're normally physically in the building,
Yeah.
you get surrounded for like 45 minutes and we have to push you out of the room to continue.
Right, to get somebody else in.
So I think we're good then. So, oh wait, one last question.
Yeah, it's not a question, it's just more of a comment. I just wanted to say thank you, Bill, for building a great machine. And thank you, Margaret, for making sure that these stories get preserved.
Well, thank you. And I pass that on to the whole team whenever we do talk. And Dave Haney's 60-year birthday is coming up pretty soon. And so that'll be a good chance to like pass that on to everybody. So thank you for that.
So thank you again. And, you know, I really look forward personally to reading the book. So, and I'm really amazed that this stuff is still working 35 years later, because you did plan it to die between 3 to 5 years, so they'd have to buy another one.
Something like that. Yeah, I won't disagree too strongly.
I'm sure Jack worked that in somehow. So thanks, everyone. And we'll see you hopefully in person at VCF East in New Jersey in the fall.
Yes, we'll be there.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks, Margaret. Thanks, Earl.
everybody.